All right, we are back yet again. I don't even know what number episode this is, but we're definitely deep into it. I am your co-host, Craig, and I am joined by the host, Beth Egan, all the way from beautiful Syracuse, New York. We have an interesting show for you today. We have the professor author, David Greenberg from Rutgers University, and David is here to talk about an interesting book that he wrote a few years back. So it's a book about the presidents and the media, and I think we're going to have a really great far-flung conversation about that topic. I mean, the media and the presidents, I know, is not a hot topic these days, right, Beth? Nobody ever hears from our president these
thinking about
days.
it at all.
So yeah. But we're not going to talk about president. This is not a political show. We are the media show, after all. We're going to take you back. And what I always learned as I'm wearing my history buff T-shirt today, Beth, this was a Christmas gift from the family, is history repeats itself. And I think that David has an amazing amount of knowledge, and I think we can learn a lot from it. I am really excited to have him in. Beth, your thoughts on this quickly before we're joined by David.
It is absolutely one of my favorite topics. And politics is actually one of the reasons I got into advertising to begin with. Like, I was just fascinated by, I grew up more or less in the 70s. So, I was young when Watergate was happening, but was aware of it. And then so excited about Jimmy Carter, and to watch that fall just really drew me in. So the fact that we have David with us here today, like, I'm fangirling for sure.
All right, let's bring him in. We're gonna do our quick opener, and then we're gonna bring David in. So give us a couple of seconds, and we'll launch that. All right, we are in and we are recording. Professor Beth Egan and I, your co-host Craig, from various locations. We are joined by a professor at Rutgers University in the beautiful state of New Jersey, a state that all three of us know well. I, of course, am the resident of Jersey City here. We're joined by David Greenberg, author, contributor to a lot of the media. We're going to put all this in the notes, all the ways that you can read David. I was introduced to David's work probably about a year ago, when I picked up a copy of The Republic of Spin. The title just grabbed me. I was looking for a book in the relationship between presidents, senators, media. I just didn't really know much about it. And this book, I've actually, as I told David in the intro, I read it twice. Professor Beth, you'll be proud of me for that. I know you're grading me. And we are joined, and I think, David, I wanted to start. Obviously, the book really kind of picks up with, and I want to correct me if I'm wrong. You wrote the book, my friend. It's kind of McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, who's affectionately then turned into an acronym of just TR in the book. So you didn't have to type it out. I totally get you on that one. TR appears all the way through the book and has great influence. And as a little bit of a history buff myself, I understand the relationship of that in terms of the Republic of Spin. I mean, here you have really the first chunk of technology coming out of the Great War and coming into the Great War, right? The telegraph. We have that kind of at the end of the turn of the century. This leads us to radio. But what fascinated me, Beth, is two things in the book, and why I was really excited to have David join us. Number one, the influence of advertising, particularly Madison Avenue advertising agencies, that now are part of these huge conglomerates, but let's call them the J. Walter Thompsons of the world, the Young and Rubicam, the kind of madmen, right? Era of agencies that I was just on Madison Avenue yesterday. I don't think any of them are on Madison Avenue anymore.
Actually,
New York real estate.
I think DDB Needham might still be there, but
right. Oh, corrected me. Thank you, Professor.
I believe so.
And then the one thing that I think is interesting, and I wanted to start off with this, David, is I think a lot of us who are kind of these armchair historians and people who've learned, we're kind of introduced to media through the lens of this famous debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Milhouse Nixon in 1960, if I'm not mistaken, maybe towards the end of the year. But that's not actually how this works. And you go into great detail about how the media was focused, the newspaper men were focused on senators before the presidents. And then then we have this kind of Teddy Roosevelt era where we have telegraph and radio, but then TV explodes on the scene. And of all people, a famous general, a two-term president, right, who could have been a Democrat or Republican, recruited on both sides of the ball to be their candidate. In comes Eisenhower. And it's Eisenhower and his staff that bring us the first presidential briefing. Tell us a little bit about that in context and what you think about it as a vehicle and how it changed the presidency.
Yes, I mean, a lot there to
yeah, sorry.
No. It's, so the overall framework of the book, as you say, it goes back to the early part of the 20th century and a little bit with McKinley, but then really with Teddy Roosevelt when we first have the media presidency. And I think a lot of people are surprised by this. Kind of one of the things I want to show in the book is that spin is not new, that presidential attention to media image, to shaping the message, to engaging public opinion, that's not new. And we do sometimes think, oh, well, it comes in with television and it comes in with Kennedy, or people even think about, Reagan as the first media president. But, it really goes way back. Now, television is still obviously a very significant development, even though, it's remarkable when you look at the radio presidents like FDR and even the folks in the 20s who are also using radio. It's remarkable how at the time that's written about as a dramatic change. And is radio going to change the character of our democracy? And is radio changing the way that we get to know our presidents and so on? So when television comes in, it's yet another step forward in sort of the president having a kind of direct access, a direct pipeline to the public. And there's also, because, of the illusion that it creates, the illusion that the person is there with you in your living room, even more so than FDR's fireside chats created that image, because you didn't see FDR, but now you could see Eisenhower, hear Eisenhower, and it creates a certain kind of intimacy. Eisenhower is interesting because he's the last president born in the 19th century. He's, not a young man when he comes to office. So you wouldn't necessarily think him to be an innovator. But has enough political sense to say, I don't understand television, but I'm willing to trust in my television advisors to sort of help me succeed in this new modern age where facility with image and message is kind of a prerequisite for the job. Just before we get to Eisenhower's own press conferences, when he runs against Adlai Stevenson in 1952 and then again in 56, it's kind of a textbook case of one man being open to this new medium and what it can do for him, and another being highly resistant. Eisenhower did these 30-second spots, as they were called, the first TV ads, which have since become such a staple of presidential campaigns. Stevenson, who is very high-minded, he looked down on this and he said, I'm not going to participate in selling the candidates like breakfast cereal. Like he was so disdainful of it. And, he had a TV advisor, a guy named Luke Cowan, who was also at CBS. And Stevenson's in his hotel room. And when the vertical hold, older listeners may remember like the old TVs when the vertical would go on the fritz. He calls in Luke Cowan to fix it. He's a TV guy. He really has no appreciation of like the art of it, the value of it. Eisenhower kind of doesn't either, but at least he's like, let's bring on, he had Rosser Reeves, the great ad man, designing spots for him, kind of these hard sell spots. Eisenhower Answers America. It would be a man on the street, who they would interview outside Rockefeller Center and, give some questions. And then Eisenhower would give a very, these ads today, it looks like a very canned, scripted reading from cue cards kind of. But at the time, it was incredibly effective. So Eisenhower's ready to use TV. And he actually puts the press conferences on television. Everybody gives credit to John F. Kennedy. The difference, of course, was Kennedy would go live. So Kennedy, it was compared to like a high wire act without a net. Whereas Eisenhower, they taped them and they would sometimes edit them. And that could be a little controversial because what are you editing out? And the AP would try to report on, well, there was a little more to it than you saw on TV. So there was this experience of watching the president answer questions. He also loved to give primetime addresses from the Oval Office. And again, this, we still have it occasionally, but this was really a staple of presidential communication kind of into the 80s and a little bit into the 90s.
Yeah, this was interesting. I mean, obviously the press conference, and by the way, I will add the link to the press conference. There is a great question asked in that press conference where somebody asked him about the budget, and he basically says, I'm not reading that thing. And I'm not answering questions on it. I mean, can you imagine that today? Like, well, you don't know your stats.
I can't imagine it today.
Well, I'm sure nobody's. But he really he's really very honest. It's very interesting, like compared to where we would be today. Oh, I've read it. I just don't. You would get that answer. I wanted to talk about two things. Come back to two things.
Yeah,
there's a great episode. I know you two are probably massive fans of a show called Drunk History. And Drunk History does an incredible job of showcasing the back and forth that is carried forward by two presidents of the United States and the Revolutionary War period, Thomas Jefferson and President Adams. And they employ newspaper men and everybody else to throw stones at each other. And they have this terrible correspondence. So we've had media involvement since the very, very beginning. And obviously your knowledge, David, of, the 19th century and the Coolidges and all that stuff, obviously, dramatic, right? Like the transformation, the radio comes in. When Eisenhower does this, he is flanked by a lot of people, it seems, from Madison Avenue, from Hollywood, from, it blew my mind thinking, I don't know, I had this thought that presidents didn't really have that until Reagan. Why is this not talked about? Why didn't Mad Men talk about this? What was missing there? Why is not, that I mentioned earlier, Benton Bowles and J. Walter Thompson and all these characters.
Yeah. Well, Mad Men, there's, I think in season 1 or early in the series, they have the Nixon account, if you remember. So there is that. They're helping Nixon. I think it's the 1960 campaign. But yeah, this stuff generally gets forgotten. And it's partly, I think our journalists don't have the institutional memory. So every time a campaign purports to be doing something new, it's kind of hailed like we're always hearing unprecedented this and unprecedented that. And obviously with the current president, there is a lot that's unprecedented. But there's also a lot that just draws on these much older traditions. And, you really first start seeing the use of advertising people in the 20s.
Right.
So there's a guy named Albert Lasker, who is a big deal, ad man who's advising Warren Harding. Coolidge relies on a guy named Bruce Barton, who becomes one of the B's in BBD&O. Barton also in the 20s is a best-selling author, writes a history or life of Jesus, kind of portraying him as a salesman, and, kind of giving, it's kind of that era of like Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. So it's all about presentation and salesmanship. It's a very modern ethos by the time you get to the 20s. Barton is close with Coolidge, and the whole image that Calvin Coolidge has of Silent Cal, of this.
Yeah.
So, it's not false. And one of the things I argue is that presidential or political images aren't false. They're just selectively chosen and sculpted and, presented. It's usually, if you're presenting someone as fundamentally different from who they really are, it doesn't work. You have to draw on their real qualities, and you play up certain things and you play down certain things. Coolidge also worked with Edward Bernays, who was in PR, not advertising, but similar world. People may know he was Sigmund Freud's nephew, sometimes called the father of public relations in this country, although that was a bit of his own public relations.
Good work.
For a generation before. And he's thinking about publicity stunts. He brings in all these Broadway actors to come to the White House one morning for Vermont. Coolidge was originally from Vermont, for a good old Vermont breakfast of griddle cakes, pancakes, and this gets front page news. So they're very much aware of drawing on these emerging fields and increasingly sophisticated fields of advertising, PR, also pulling people from journalism who are, thinking about these issues. And in some ways, I talk about in the book, the 20th century sees the emergence of a new political type. We call them spin doctors or consultants. Like their skill is the traffic in symbol, in word, in image. We still need the people who can do ward canvassing the wards and knowing, district and neighborhood. That's still a part of politics, but increasingly politics on a national level through radio and then TV. It's about these experts in image craft.
And then I wanted to fast forward. We might come back only because this topic has, obviously he has a long career in politics, the great comeback of Nixon, but Nixon and Kennedy, in your description of that, which I think should be, I say that, I seriously, I think it should be required for people to kind of read this component of your book, this chapter. I think it actually spans a couple of chapters, I think in the book, is the debate itself, right? And your description of Kennedy, he's not in great shape, right? There's all this, it seems like there's this kind of setup, right? Like the Kennedy people knew he really wasn't well. Nixon, I guess, was sick. I can't remember
And Nixon was recuperating from an illness. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is fascinating because when you learn this out of a textbook, and I'm looking at my kids' textbooks when I walk in here all the time, I keep them. They make it seem like Kennedy is like a super athlete Iron Man, right? He walks in and he cleans this guy's clock. Yet your description of the debate is it's really a very civilized debate between two guys who take the train with each other, who really kind of know one another, and there's respect. And the debate, I went back and thanks to you, I watched it. There's a lot of real political jockeying in there. I think that it's like I don't know how to equate this. Like there have been NBA basketball finals that have been kind of gentleman sweeps. One team wins 4 out of 5, but all the games are close, right? But we remember it as like a gentleman sweep or a sweep. Like the fact that they might have come close to winning. Was Nixon, in your opinion, if Nixon is not sick, if Nixon is not recuperating, if Nixon is made up a little bit better, is this a draw?
I think it's very hard to do the counterfactuals. There was the question of Nixon, not looking good, and there's sort of a myth that people who listened on radio thought Nixon won. People watched television thought Kennedy won. That's really based on like some tiny single marketing survey out of Philadelphia, and it really, I think we have to consign that to the pile of myth. I think the truth is Kennedy was really the underdog going in. He was seen, even though they were around the same age and similar experience. Obviously, Nixon been vice president. Kennedy didn't have that experience, but they both come to Congress in 46. But Kennedy was seen as this kind of callow playboy. He wasn't taken as seriously as a heavyweight. And Nixon really was, this earnest, formal guy. He had, traveled the world as vice president and was kind of seen, despite having certain negative qualities associated with him as well, but as like a serious guy who was ready for the presidency. So partly it's, Kennedy looks more handsome and his coat, his jacket looks better against the background in the Chicago studio. But it's also that here's a guy who comes out, stands toe-to-toe with the vice president, is very substantive. And, I think that as much as anything gets Kennedy kind of a new look from, people who maybe had been prepared to discount him. And the polling showed, I found memos in the Kennedy library where Lou Harris, the pollster, says, after this debate, this is the first time we're seeing open water, as he put it in the polling. So, it's conceivable Nixon could have done better. I mean, the other thing to remember about Nixon is 8 years earlier, when he's nominated as vice president, he's almost kicked off the ticket because of a scandal. And he goes on television in, one of the first televised addresses, addressing the biggest televised audience that anyone had ever enjoyed in what comes to be called the Checker speech.
Yeah, famous.
And, liberals sort of made fun of this speech. They thought Nixon was sort of sentimental and hokey. He's talking about, yes, we did get a gift. It was a little Cocker Spaniel named Checkers for my daughter, etc. But the speech worked and it was effective. So Nixon was someone who was capable of using television well. It was just that the medium was changing and audiences' expectations were changing. And he was almost overconfident that he could beat Kennedy in a debate and he could use television, that, he didn't realize how the expectations were changing and how Kennedy was now the one with the leg up.
Yeah, there's that actually is a very interesting component, the Checkers. You actually marked that really well in the book. He does come in a little bit like I can handle this, and it doesn't quite work out. The next, so with Nixon and Kennedy, we then, of course, tragedy strikes. We get one of the great characters in American political history, LBJ.
Yeah.
And you do an amazing job, because I've read some stuff on LBJ in my past. And he's also, he's kind of he has to rid himself of Bobby Kennedy. He's sitting on top of the Kennedy legacy. He comes in here and he's great when things are great. Right. And then you describe that he is not great when things are bad and the media, kind of question him. And I think that we've seen in our more modern times, we see that with some of our presidents. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like in terms of this kind of, it's great. When everybody's behind me, economy's going great and we're doing wonderful stuff. But as soon as they kind of start to have some problems, LBJ really kind of gets in trouble, right?
Yeah. Well, so one way I think of it is we have this false notion that presidents who are successful succeed because they manipulate the media, that their communication skills are kind of determinative of their success. And while, of course, communication skills matter, I mean, that's partly what the book is about. I also found that time and time again, there are people who come into the presidency hailed as like communications geniuses. And then when they're confronted with difficult policy challenges, they are suddenly not only seen as failed presidents, but as bad communicators. So this is true for Herbert Hoover, who in 28, when he runs for president, it does the first big campaign film called Master of Emergencies, which you can see on YouTube, and talks about how as Commerce Secretary, he dealt with the Mississippi flood of 1927 and all kinds of things. Carter, if you look at the early clips on him, is seen as this master of the media. And then
this is where I was going. I mean, I can't believe when I read that, and my mother, bless her for her heart, loved Carter, right?
Yeah.
And always said this to me, and I never believed her because I grew up with Reagan, right? I mean, I was unable, Reagan was the president that dominated my lifetime. Right. And I'm thinking Carter's a loser.
No. I remember that vividly. Carter was, for me, Carter was sort of the John F. Kennedy. He again, defeated. Well, at the time it was Ford, but yeah, absolutely. Carter was seen as a brilliant,
right. And in particular, they talked about his media skills. There's one New York Times magazine cover of Carter, like in the control room, like with the monitors for ABC, NBC, CBS, and he's kind of mastering it all. And again, I was going to say the same thing with Lyndon Johnson. When he takes over from Kennedy after the assassination, he steps right into the role. He gives this wonderful speech to Congress. Kennedy had said in his inaugural address, laying out how much there was to do, but let us begin. Johnson in his speech says, let us continue. He picks up the mantle of
He Kennedy. Also makes sure, you point out in the book, he makes sure Jackie Kennedy is there with it, right? Was that one of his ad men, or like the PR people are kind of like, oh, we need this shot. We need her and him together. There's a lot of stuff here that's really incredible.
I think that was his own sort of instinct that when he's on the plane, getting sworn in Dallas, he wants Jackie to be there in the shot because he knows it's going to confer a certain kind of legitimacy. Obviously, constitutionally, he's legitimate, but having public opinion support him. And in these early days, and even through much of 64, when everybody would agree he's a fabulous president, he's also seen as a great communicator.
Right.
But then when we get to Vietnam and, the war goes badly and there's deception about, the prospects for American victory or South Vietnamese victory, suddenly he's, got all these problems as a media president and is compared unfavorably to Kennedy. So, sometimes we may have it backwards. It may be, it is being successful that gets you remembered as the great communicator.
Yeah.
And if you're an unsuccessful president, we look back and say, well, he had a hard time getting his message across.
It's kind of the same in the classroom though, David, right? Like if the student's doing well in your class, you're a great professor.
Right.
If they're not, you're horrible.
Yeah, exactly. So, LBJ really struggled. And of course he did have certain ways in which he did struggle to reach the public because in private, and people did see this side of him, he was so down to earth and even crude, but sometimes in a kind of funny, appealing way. But when he would go on TV, he would get oddly formal, and it was not his best way. I mean, I think we've seen other presidential candidates like this over the years. I think that was a big part
of Hillary's problem.
Right, Hillary's problem, or somebody like, Al Gore or Mitt Romney, like that kind of stiffness before the camera. They're often not like that in person. Like in person, they can be much more down to earth and skilled at communication. But that business of presenting yourself to a mass public it is a different set of talents for sure.
And he's and
Well,
he's
as
a oh, go ahead.
someone,
Sorry.
someone who has a picture of Al Gore in my bathroom, I
Uh-huh.
can confirm that he is very personable in person.
Yeah, I've met
We
Gore
actually share the same
too.
birthday.
Yeah, and I've met Hillary, and
Yes.
yeah, I mean, Hillary's incredible in
Hilarious. It's
person.
hilarious. Yeah.
And sometimes that comes across in interviews in certain ways in public, but just overall on the campaign trail, she conveyed a certain inauthenticity. People say, that's a complicated word, but it's kind of a theme. I think it's become a theme in our politics with the advent of media and communication as being so central to the presidential and campaigning project.
Yeah, and I think this is relevant in terms of how we're thinking about politics and media. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that our female presidential candidates have. I think for Hillary, she didn't really have an option. As a woman in politics during that period, you weren't taken seriously unless you were serious. And so by the time she came around to running for president, that wasn't working for her. But I felt really badly because that was her training. I think it was almost impossible for her to break out of that.
Right.
And Kamala being younger than her, different training, but I think faced same challenges.
Yeah, and I think women face this dilemma where, if you're too feminine seeming, then you get knocked for not being, serious enough and up for the job and presidential enough. And if you downplay that too much, then you sort of get knocked for being kind of like masculine and mannish. And like I do think women face, as far as we've come as a society, in sexism and so on, we still maintain that kind of double standard a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me, as I mentioned, I wanted to rewind a little bit as we talked about LBJ, and we've now touched a little bit into the modern era with Hillary and Kamala. Was Kennedy as good as he was as he's been propped up to be? In the book, you kind of mentioned some stuff where he wasn't that great with the media. Is that correct?
Well, look, I mean, like all presidents, he has ups and downs, strengths and weaknesses. I think generally he is pretty successful. Like those press conferences, again, you can go online and watch them. Like he is quite adept at that sort of thing. But there's lots of other times, with the Bay of Pigs, with certain, other challenges he has where he gets a lot of bad press. And sometimes he reacts in not so honorable ways, in lashing out at journalists, even sort of having journalists surveiled.
I was shocked.
Yeah, it's never as kind of simple a picture as. And look, this is just the way it works in the culture, even in the textbooks. You kind of have to simplify, and you sort of have to leave a lot out. And so what I think this book does is it sort of brings the full richness of each of these presidents, who were their advisors, their media people. And also, I have a lot about critics, journalists.
Yeah, it's chock full of it. Yeah.
Right. Even people like Gary Trudeau in how he portrayed Carter, or Stephen Colbert in how he portrayed Bush. These are people who I see as like commentators and analysts about the culture of spin. And their thoughts, sometimes explicit, sometimes more indirect, about what does this all mean for democracy, the way that we're, speech and image become so crafted and planned on the part of presidents and candidates. And are we getting a true sense of who our representatives are, and what does that mean for our democracy? I think all those kinds of questions kind of come to the fore as we become, as a public, very much aware of, how much the communication strategy becomes central to what they're doing.
If I can ask, I know we're into a few extra minutes here, but I did want to ask about Teddy Roosevelt. The book kind of opens, certainly McKinley's in there, but TR is referenced throughout the book, right? He's doing a lot of firsts here. And I think it's worth it to understand, his relationship with the media. And I think that it's such an important component of the book. And I think that people need to understand, in your opinion, is he the first kind of, this kind of populist, modern, like media forward president? I know I've positioned Ike as that in this context for television,
right?
But TR really kind of he brings this to the fore.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I should say first, I mean, you mentioned, Jefferson versus Adams,
Yeah.
George Washington, paid attention to his image and how he, rode on his horse. And you can go all the way back to the Greeks and rhetoric and the art of rhetoric. So spin in that sense is as old as politics. And you can say it's embedded in politics. You can't have people practicing politics without being mindful of how they craft their message and image. Okay. So nothing's brand new. Right. But I think what you see with Teddy Roosevelt is both the man and the moment. The presidency is changing. America has changed dramatically in the decades after the Civil War. Instead of a bunch of interconnected small communities, it's a huge nation with these big problems, social problems, economic problems that just can't be addressed at the local and state level anymore. You need a strong hand in Washington. So the president, it's not that strong in office for most of the 19th century. We remember a few strong presidents like Lincoln or Andrew Jackson, but we don't remember most of them. They didn't do that much. As you said before, if you were a journalist covering Washington, you would go to the Senate press galleries. That's where the action was.
This is so well described in the book, David. I never dawned on me because there's a lot of documentation. Like, well, we just forget about those presidents. There are a lot of people who don't even know the names of those presidents, and the reason why is because it's the senators that are they're the guys who are being approached by their local press and then some national press.
Yeah, and the Washington press. I mean, they're the ones who are driving the agenda. Like now we think of, even though we know the Senate, Congress is the legislative branch, we think of the president comes in with his agenda and gets it through Congress, right? But it used to be legislation really originated with Congress, and the president would support it or not support it. And the president was just like a smaller figure in the overall system. But that starts to change kind of with industrialization, with the growth of America, immigration. We have these huge scale problems which people come to see can only be addressed from Washington and only be addressed with a stronger presidency. And so this is what we call the progressive era. And Teddy Roosevelt is really the first one, but we also, I put Woodrow Wilson a few years later in this category. They really want to use the power of the presidency to address all kinds of economic and social problems that just previously had gone unaddressed. The amount of legislation and the amount of activity that those two presidents in particular have just kind of dwarfs almost all of their predecessors. Now, with Roosevelt, it's also tied to his appreciation of the way media are changing. And so, as you said, all these firsts, he's really the first one to have these kind of mini press conferences, which he sometimes holds as he's getting his afternoon shave. And he'll, reporters will come in and he'll hold forth on, whatever the subject is he wants to talk about. He's doing press releases. He brings in professionals to be, he doesn't technically have a press secretary, but like with the Panama Canal Project, he brings in a journalist to be like his press guy on that. He's doing publicity stunts. So he'll go into a little submarine goes to the bottom of Long Island Sound, makes front page news. And this is attention for how he thinks the Navy needs to start doing submarines. So Teddy Roosevelt is using the media in these innovative ways. He's setting up practices and institutions that his successors then have to avail themselves of. And that's why I think he's such a seminal figure. It's not like the idea of paying attention to the press is new. He's just developing, tools and techniques to kind of make this part of the presidential machinery.
Yeah, it booms. The media booms with him, right? I mean, I saw like newsprint, everything kind of just floats up, ratings, radios. Yeah.
And you also, have the first films. I mean, it's not really during his presidency. It's a little bit afterwards. You start to get the newsreels with Teddy. He would have his voice recorded on wax cylinders. It was like little records that you could play. So all this use of media, photography is coming in. Like, there was very little photographing of presidents. But, by Teddy Roosevelt, and especially by the 20s, I found these articles about Calvin Coolidge, most photographed man in America, and he's listed like Babe Ruth and other celebrities. Like, that's when the president is this figure. We all know what he looks like, what he sounds like. He's in our homes. That wasn't quite the case in the 19th century. So there's the transformation in the president's power and role, but there's also this transformation in his relationship to public opinion.
All right. Well, last thing, because I'm curious. The book ends with Barack Obama.
Right.
The next question. What are we? When am I getting my second edition with 3 very important chapters, one after another? Is this or how are we getting this?
Well, I've thought about that. When I finished the manuscript, it was for the end of 2014, I guess it was, and the book wasn't published. Publishing takes a little while till early 16. And so Trump was not in the book. And many people urged me do a sequel, do an epilogue. And I even had the title, which is going to be Beyond Spin, because I do think Trump has sort of taken us into new realms and broken certain rules and established certain other patterns. But that said, when it came time to confront, did I want to write such a book? Honestly, I didn't want to be spending more time than I already was in the company of Trump every day. Right. And I settled on, instead, I wrote a biography that was just published a few months ago of the Congressman John Lewis, who represents a very different set of our traditions and, fights for democracy. And so I put the work on spin and media aside and wrote a biography of John Lewis, which I've been out talking about and enjoying. He passed away, as people know, a few years ago, but sort of enjoying kind of reflecting on his legacy and what we can draw from it for these difficult times.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you. This has been fantastic. I hope we can have you back as things progress, because we're only 3 months into our current presidency right now. And I think we've got a lot coming down the pipe in terms of, we talked about new technology, and I did want to talk about the past election. And, I don't need to necessarily talk about Trump. I actually am more interested in Biden. What happened there is truly remarkable. I mean, he gets elected, you just don't hear from him. It's just and now the contrast obviously is, you can't get away. Like Beth and I were discussing the Super Bowl. Like, this is the first time in my lifetime that the Super Bowl had basically 2 days of coverage after the game. Trump so solidly swallowed up with the Panama Canal and Greenland that nobody was talking about post-game Super Bowl on Super Bowl Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday after the Super Bowl. So we've got a lot to discuss, but I'd like to talk about when these presidents aren't grabbing the bully pulpit. If that could be our second time recording. And I have nothing but thanks. This was a really great time, David. Beth, anything on your end?
No, such a treat to have a chance to talk to you, and such great insights. And just thank you for joining us.
Well, likewise, really my pleasure. Great conversation, and obviously a lot more we could talk about, but we'll we'll save that for next time.
Maybe we'll try to all get together. We'll open up a couple bottles of red wine. We'll hang some microphones and we'll really get to the inside info. David, it was absolutely a pleasure for me. On behalf of Beth and I, the media show, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. And
thank you.
I enjoyed the book. I'm going to put all of your book links into the description. And we hope to hear from you soon. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Beth. Really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye. Have a great weekend. Bye.